My ex-husband's lawyer confidently demanded half of what he called my pathetic collection of nothing during our bitter divorce proceedings. What he didn't know was that beneath my carefully maintained facade of financial struggle lay a $67 million trust fund that I had kept secret for 8 years of marriage. His smug expression would soon transform into something I will never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The oak-paneled conference room at Morrison, Blackwell & Associates felt suffocating as I sat across from my soon-to-be ex-husband Richard and his attorney, the notorious Harrison Wade. The late afternoon sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness that had consumed my marriage over the past 2 years. I clutched my worn leather purse closer to my chest, maintaining the appearance of a woman whose financial security hung by the thinnest of threads. Harrison Wade leaned back in his expensive leather chair, with the practiced arrogance of a man who had built his reputation on extracting maximum settlements from vulnerable spouses. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his $3,000 suit pressed to perfection, and his cold blue eyes held the predatory gleam of someone who viewed divorce proceedings as a blood sport, where only the most ruthless survived. "Mrs. Castellano," Wade began, his voice dripping with condescension as he shuffled through papers that detailed what he believed to be my meager financial circumstances. "Let's be realistic about your situation. You have no significant assets, no meaningful income, and frankly, my client has been supporting your lifestyle for years. We're prepared to be generous despite your limited contributions to this marriage." Richard sat beside his lawyer with a smugness that made my stomach turn. The man I had once loved had transformed into someone unrecognizable during our marriage. His initial charm giving way to controlling behavior, emotional manipulation, and ultimately, infidelity that he barely bothered to hide. His designer clothes and confident posture reflected his belief that he held all the power in this room, that I was nothing more than a discarded accessory from his life that needed to be disposed of as cheaply as possible. My own attorney, Sarah Chen, a sharp family law practitioner I had carefully selected for reasons that would become clear later, maintained her professional composure while taking notes. Sarah understood the strategy we had developed over months of preparation, though even she did not know the full extent of what was about to unfold. The groundwork for this moment had been laid with meticulous precision, and every detail of my apparent vulnerability had been carefully crafted for this exact scenario. Wade continued his theatrical presentation with the confidence of a man who believed he was addressing a defenseless victim. "Your client's financial disclosure shows minimal savings, no significant investments, and employment history that can only be described as sporadic at best. She has been entirely dependent on my client's generosity throughout their marriage. We're willing to offer a settlement that frankly exceeds what she deserves." The irony was almost overwhelming as I listened to Wade's assessment of my supposed financial desperation. He had no idea that I was the granddaughter of Elena Montrose, the textile heiress whose business empire had generated hundreds of millions of dollars over 6 decades. More importantly, he could not possibly know that I had inherited a trust fund worth $67 million on my 21st birthday, a fortune I had kept completely hidden throughout my relationship with Richard. The decision to conceal my wealth had been made deliberately and maintained consistently since the day I met Richard at a charity fundraiser 8 years earlier. I had witnessed too many relationships destroyed by money, too many people who were loved for their bank accounts rather than their character. My grandmother had warned me about fortune hunters and gold diggers, sharing stories of family members whose lives had been ruined by people who saw dollar signs instead of human beings. Richard had pursued me believing I was Elena Castellano, a struggling artist who worked part-time at a gallery while trying to build a career in painting. This persona was not entirely fabricated. I genuinely loved art and had spent years developing my skills as a painter. However, my modest apartment in Brooklyn and secondhand clothes were choices rather than necessities, lifestyle decisions that allowed me to experience authentic relationships without the complications that vast wealth inevitably created. The elaborate deception had required tremendous discipline and careful planning. I maintained a separate identity for managing my trust fund, working with a discreet financial advisory firm that specialized in high-net-worth clients who valued privacy above all else. My grandmother's estate attorneys had established multiple layers of protection that made it virtually impossible for casual investigation to uncover my true financial status. Throughout our marriage, Richard had never questioned my background or investigated my family history beyond what I chose to share. His own narcissistic tendencies made him more interested in talking about himself than learning about my past, and his assumption that I was financially dependent suited his need to feel superior and controlling. The man who claimed to love me had never bothered to truly know me. Wade's voice brought me back to the present moment as he outlined the settlement terms with obvious satisfaction. My client is prepared to provide temporary spousal support of $2,000 monthly for 18 months, after which Mrs. Castellano will be expected to achieve financial independence. Additionally, she may retain her personal belongings and the 2018 Honda Civic currently in her possession. We believe this represents an extremely generous offer given her circumstances. The settlement offer was insulting in its assumptions and laughably inadequate considering what Richard had put me through during our marriage. However, it perfectly served my purposes by demonstrating his complete disrespect for my contributions to our relationship and his fundamental misunderstanding of who I actually was. The moment I had been preparing for over the past 6 months was finally arriving. Sarah Chen cleared her throat and placed her pen down with deliberate precision, a signal that we had rehearsed during our preparation sessions. Mr. Wade, before my client responds to your offer, there are some additional financial disclosures that need to be presented to the court. It appears there have been some oversights in the discovery process that require immediate correction. Wade's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his confident facade, as he sensed that something was not proceeding according to his expectations. Richard straightened in his chair, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand what additional assets I could possibly possess that would affect the settlement negotiations. Neither of them was prepared for what was about to unfold. Sarah opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder containing documentation that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of our divorce proceedings. The papers inside represented months of preparation, with forensic accountants, private investigators, and legal experts who specialized in complex financial disclosure cases. The strategy we had developed was about to transform me from a parent victim to someone with resources and options that neither Richard nor his attorney had imagined possible. Your Honor will be interested to learn about several significant assets that were not included in the initial financial disclosures, Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who held decisive evidence. Additionally, there are some concerning irregularities in Mr. Castellano's own financial representations that warrant immediate investigation. The color began to drain from Richard's face as he realized that his carefully constructed narrative about our financial circumstances was about to be challenged. Wade's professional composure wavered as he understood that his routine divorce case was about to become significantly more complicated than he had anticipated. The power dynamic in the room was shifting in real time, though neither of them yet understood the magnitude of what was coming. I maintained my quiet demeanor while internally savoring the moment I had been planning since discovering Richard's infidelity 18 months earlier. His betrayal had hurt deeply, but it had also liberated me from any obligation to protect him from the consequences of underestimating someone he had never bothered to truly understand. The woman he thought he knew was about to reveal herself as someone entirely different. Sarah continued her presentation with methodical precision, building tension while revealing information that systematically dismantled the assumptions underlying Wade's settlement offer. Mrs. Castellano has been the beneficiary of a substantial trust fund since her 21st birthday, assets that were deliberately kept separate from marital property for protective purposes. The total value of these assets, as of the most recent valuation, exceeds $67 million. The silence that followed Sarah's statement was profound and electric. Wade's mouth opened slightly as he struggled to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the case. Richard stared at me with a combination of shock, confusion, and dawning realization that his understanding of our entire relationship had been fundamentally flawed. The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic. I was no longer the financially desperate woman that Wade had been condescending to for the past hour. Instead, I was revealed as someone with resources that dwarfed Richard's own financial position, and the power to turn his attempted exploitation back on him with devastating effectiveness. But the revelation of my trust fund was only the beginning of what I had prepared for this moment. The investigation I had quietly conducted into Richard's own financial activities had uncovered irregularities that would soon make his demand for spousal support seem not just inappropriate but potentially criminal. The man who had tried to leave me with nothing was about to discover that his own financial house was built on foundations that would not withstand scrutiny. As the implications of Sarah's announcement settled over the room, I allowed myself a small smile while maintaining the composed dignity that had served me well throughout this ordeal. The moment of revelation that I had been building toward for months was finally here, and the satisfaction was even greater than I had imagined it would be. Before we continue with Elena's incredible journey from apparent victim to empowered woman in control of her destiny, I want to acknowledge something important. If you have ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or taken advantage of by someone who thought they knew your worth, this story is for you. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is patience, preparation, and the strategic revelation of strengths that others never suspected you possessed. If you believe that true power comes from authentic self-knowledge and careful planning rather than loud declarations, please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us share more stories of people who turned their greatest challenges into their most empowering victories. The look of disbelief on Richard's face as the reality of my hidden wealth began to sink in was worth every month of careful planning and strategic patience I had invested in reaching this moment. The man who had spent our entire marriage treating me as financially dependent was about to learn that I had never needed his support and had chosen to accept it only as part of maintaining the relationship I had hoped we could build together. Wade's professional demeanor cracked as he realized that his client's position had shifted from advantageous to potentially disastrous in the span of a single sentence. The lawyer who had entered the room expecting to negotiate a minimal settlement with a desperate woman was now facing someone with resources to hire the best legal representation available and the financial independence to walk away from any arrangement that did not serve her interests. The power dynamic that had defined our marriage and shaped Richard's expectations for our divorce had been completely reversed in one strategic moment. The woman he had underestimated and taken for granted was about to demonstrate that she possessed not only substantial financial resources, but also the intelligence and patience to use them effectively. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. However, the revelation of my trust fund represented just the opening move in a much larger strategy that I had developed to ensure justice for the betrayal and emotional abuse I had endured. Richard's shocked expression would soon transform into something far more desperate as he began to understand the full implications of trying to manipulate someone whose capabilities he had never bothered to discover. The game that Richard thought he was winning was about to change rules entirely, with consequences that would extend far beyond our divorce settlement into questions about his own conduct and financial integrity that I had been quietly investigating while he believed I was too naive and dependent to pose any threat to his interests. Elena Castellano, the struggling artist, was about to disappear forever, replaced by Elena Montrose Castellano, heiress and strategic thinker who had spent 8 years learning exactly who Richard really was beneath his charming facade. The education I had received about his character during our marriage was about to prove far more valuable than any degree, and far more expensive for him than he could have imagined possible. The silence that followed Sarah Chen's revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it lasted perhaps 30 seconds in reality. Harrison Wade's carefully practiced composure crumbled as he processed the implications of representing a client who had fundamentally misunderstood his opponent's position. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly agape, as he stared at me with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered by a single sentence. I maintained my calm exterior while internally savoring the moment I had been building toward for nearly 2 years. The psychological burden of carrying this secret throughout my marriage had been enormous, requiring constant vigilance to maintain the facade of financial dependence that had protected my trust fund from Richard's awareness and potential exploitation. The relief of finally revealing the truth was almost overwhelming, even as I prepared for the complex legal and emotional battle that would inevitably follow. The decision to conceal my inheritance had not been made lightly or without understanding the potential consequences. My grandmother Elena Montrose had built her textile empire through shrewd business decisions and an unwavering commitment to protecting her family's assets from those who would exploit them for personal gain. Her stories about fortune hunters and manipulative relationships had shaped my understanding of how wealth could corrupt genuine human connections and attract people whose interest was purely mercenary. When I inherited the trust fund at 21, I had also inherited my grandmother's wisdom about the importance of knowing whether people loved me for myself or for my bank account. The elaborate deception I had maintained for 8 years represented not just financial protection but emotional insurance against the kind of betrayal that had destroyed several of my relatives' marriages when their spouses discovered the family's true wealth. Richard's initial charm and apparent disinterest in material possessions had convinced me that he might be different from the gold diggers my grandmother had warned me about. His career as a marketing executive provided sufficient income to support a comfortable lifestyle, and his romantic gestures seemed motivated by genuine affection rather than calculated investment in a potentially profitable relationship. The early years of our courtship had felt authentic and spontaneous in ways that would have been impossible if he had known about my inheritance. However, as our relationship deepened and eventually progressed to marriage, maintaining the deception became increasingly complex and emotionally taxing. Every conversation about our future required careful editing to avoid revealing information that might lead him to investigate my background. Every financial decision had to be filtered through the persona of Elena Castellano, struggling artist, rather than Elena Montrose Castellano, trust fund beneficiary with resources that exceeded most people's wildest dreams. The psychological strain of living a double life had intensified as Richard's true character began to emerge during our marriage. His initial charm gave way to controlling behavior as he attempted to manage every aspect of our shared life according to his preferences and priorities. His respect for my independence diminished as he became increasingly possessive and demanding, treating me more like property than a partner in an equal relationship. The irony was devastating. The financial dependence that Richard believed gave him power over me was entirely fabricated, while the emotional control he exercised was unfortunately real. I found myself trapped in a marriage where I was economically independent but psychologically constrained by someone who had no understanding of my actual capabilities or resources. The woman he thought he was controlling was wealthy enough to walk away at any moment, yet bound by the deception that had been designed to protect both of us. Richard's infidelity, when I discovered it 18 months earlier, had represented the final betrayal that freed me from any obligation to continue protecting him from the truth about my identity. The private investigator I had hired to document his affairs had uncovered not just evidence of multiple relationships but also concerning irregularities in his business practices that suggested potential fraud and tax evasion. The man who had been betraying our marriage was also potentially betraying his clients and the federal government. This discovery had transformed my pain over his cheating into strategic planning for how to extract myself from the marriage, while ensuring that justice was served for both his personal and professional misconduct. The 8 years I had spent learning about Richard's character, habits, and business practices, while he remained oblivious to my true capabilities, had provided me with comprehensive intelligence that would prove invaluable in the legal proceedings ahead. The months of preparation for this moment had required extraordinary discipline and careful coordination with legal and financial professionals who understood the complexity of revealing hidden assets while simultaneously protecting them from potential claims. Sarah Chen had been selected not just for her expertise in family law, but for her experience with high-net-worth divorces involving complex trust structures and asset protection strategies. The forensic accountants and private investigators we had employed over the past 6 months had built an ironclad case that would not only protect my inheritance from Richard's claims, but would also expose his own financial improprieties to scrutiny that could result in criminal charges. The strategy we had developed was designed to ensure that his attempt to exploit what he perceived as my vulnerability would backfire with consequences far beyond anything he had imagined possible. Wade finally found his voice, though it carried none of the condescending authority that had characterized his earlier statements. "I need to see documentation of these alleged assets immediately," he demanded, his tone betraying uncertainty about his client's position for the first time during the proceedings. "These claims are highly irregular and require extensive verification before they can be considered in settlement negotiations." Sarah responded with the methodical precision of someone who had anticipated every possible objection and prepared comprehensive responses. She withdrew a thick folder containing trust documents, bank statements, investment portfolios, and legal opinions from multiple experts confirming both the existence and the protected status of my inheritance. The documentation represented months of preparation designed to establish my financial independence beyond any possible dispute. The trust fund documents revealed not only the substantial value of my inheritance, but also the sophisticated legal structures that had been established to protect it from exactly the kind of claims that Richard might attempt to make. My grandmother's attorneys had created multiple layers of protection that would make it virtually impossible for a spouse to gain access to the principal or even the income generated by the investments, unless specific conditions were met. These protective measures had been established not out of paranoia, but out of hard-won experience with family members whose marriages had been destroyed when spouses discovered the extent of the Montrose family wealth. The legal framework had been designed by experts who understood both the attractiveness of substantial assets to potential gold diggers and the importance of preserving family wealth for future generations rather than allowing it to be dissipated through divorce settlements. Richard's expression shifted from shock to calculation as he began to process the implications of my revelation. I could see his mind working through the possibilities, wondering whether there might be some way to claim a portion of assets that he had never known existed. The man who had spent our entire marriage treating me as financially dependent was now confronting the reality that I had never needed his support, and had chosen to accept it only as part of the relationship I had hoped we could build together. Wade began asking technical questions about the trust structure, attempting to identify potential vulnerabilities that might allow his client to make claims against assets that had been carefully protected through decades of sophisticated legal planning. His questions revealed both his desperation to salvage something from a case that had suddenly shifted dramatically against his client's interests, and his growing understanding that he was dealing with legal and financial complexity far beyond what he had anticipated. The revelation of my trust fund represented only the first phase of the strategy Sarah and I had developed for these proceedings. The investigation into Richard's own financial activities had uncovered irregularities that would soon make his demands for spousal support seem not just inappropriate, but potentially criminal. The man who had attempted to position himself as the primary breadwinner was about to discover that his own income sources required explanation that he might not be able to provide. As the reality of my financial independence settled over the room, I reflected on the profound psychological transformation that had occurred during the months of planning for this moment. The woman who had spent 8 years hiding her true capabilities was finally free to demonstrate the intelligence, resources, and strategic thinking that had been concealed behind the facade of artistic struggling and financial dependence. The burden of maintaining my double identity had been enormous, but it had also provided me with invaluable education about Richard's true character and the importance of authentic relationships built on genuine understanding rather than financial considerations. The painful discovery of his infidelity had ultimately liberated me from the obligation to protect someone who had never bothered to truly know or appreciate the person he claimed to love. The legal proceedings that would follow would test every aspect of my preparation and resolve, but I entered them with resources, expertise, and moral clarity that Richard could never have anticipated. The woman he had underestimated and taken for granted was about to demonstrate that true power came not from financial control over others, but from self-knowledge, careful planning, and the strategic patience to wait for the right moment to reveal one's actual capabilities. Richard's shocked silence spoke volumes about his fundamental inability to see me as anything more than an extension of his own life and ambitions. The marriage that I had hoped would be built on mutual respect and understanding had instead become a masterclass in recognizing manipulation and psychological control disguised as love and protection. The revelation that was transforming our divorce proceedings from routine settlement negotiation into complex financial litigation represented not just the end of our marriage, but the beginning of my emergence as someone free to live authentically, without the burden of concealing my true identity and capabilities from someone who had never deserved that level of trust and protection. Wade's continued questions about the trust structure revealed his growing desperation to find some angle that might benefit his client, but the legal framework that protected my inheritance had been designed by experts who had anticipated every possible challenge. The woman who had appeared vulnerable and financially dependent was proving to possess resources and legal protection that exceeded anything he had encountered in his extensive career handling high-conflict divorce cases. The game that Richard believed he was winning through superior financial position and legal representation was about to change rules entirely, with consequences that would extend far beyond our divorce settlement into questions about his own conduct and integrity that I had been quietly documenting while he remained convinced that I posed no threat to his interests or reputation. As the afternoon sun continued to stream through the conference room windows, I understood that this moment represented not just the revelation of long-hidden financial assets, but the emergence of my authentic self after years of strategic concealment. The woman Richard thought he had married was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone with the power to ensure that justice was served for both his personal betrayal and his professional misconduct. The weight of carrying the secret for so many years was finally lifting, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing that every month of careful planning and patient preparation was about to prove its worth in ways that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in our relationship, and ensure that his attempts to exploit my apparent vulnerability would backfire with devastating effectiveness. The transformation in the conference room was palpable, as Harrison Wade struggled to process documentation that systematically dismantled every assumption underlying his settlement strategy. Sarah Chen methodically presented trust agreements, financial statements, and legal opinions that revealed not only the substantial value of my inheritance, but also the sophisticated protective structures that had been established over decades of careful estate planning. Each document represented another layer of my grandmother's wisdom about preserving family wealth from those who would exploit it for personal gain. Richard's initial shock was evolving into something more complex as he began to understand that our entire marriage had been built on a fundamental deception about my financial circumstances. The woman he had believed to be dependent on his generosity was proving to possess resources that dwarfed his own income and assets. More troubling for him was the growing realization that his attempts to control me through financial manipulation had been not just ineffective, but entirely unnecessary from my perspective. The strategic mind that I had developed through years of managing my inheritance while maintaining my cover identity was finally free to operate without constraint. The business acumen that I had inherited from my grandmother, combined with the education I had received from observing Richard's behavior throughout our marriage, had prepared me for exactly this moment. The woman who had appeared vulnerable and naive was revealing herself to possess analytical capabilities and resources that neither Richard nor his attorney had imagined possible. Wade's questions about the trust structure revealed his desperation to find some angle that might benefit his client, but the legal framework protecting my inheritance had been designed by experts who specialized in high-net-worth estate planning and asset protection. The Montrose family attorneys had created multiple layers of protection that would prevent any spouse from gaining access to trust assets, regardless of the length of the marriage or the circumstances of the divorce. The trust documents revealed that my grandmother had established separate classifications for different types of assets, with the most valuable holdings placed in irrevocable structures that could not be modified without unanimous consent from multiple trustees and beneficiaries. The income generated by these investments was similarly protected, flowing through additional legal entities that maintained the separation between trust assets and any marital property claims. These sophisticated arrangements had been created not through paranoia but through hard-won experience with family members whose relationships had been damaged or destroyed when partners discovered the extent of the Montrose wealth. My grandmother had witnessed marriages that began with genuine affection deteriorate into financial exploitation when spouses realized the assets they might gain through divorce settlements or inheritance claims. The protective measures extended beyond simple asset separation to include confidentiality agreements, background investigations of potential romantic partners, and ongoing monitoring of family members' relationships for signs of financial exploitation. The systems that had protected my inheritance during my marriage to Richard represented decades of refinement based on real-world experience, with the challenges that substantial wealth created for maintaining authentic personal relationships. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to calculation as he absorbed the implications of my revelation. I could observe his mind working through possibilities, wondering whether his years of marriage might have created some claim against assets he had never known existed. His transformation from shocked husband to strategic adversary was both predictable and disappointing, confirming my grandmother's warnings about how money changed people's behavior and priorities. The irony of his position was striking. The financial dependence that he had used to justify his controlling behavior throughout our marriage had been entirely fabricated on my part, while the emotional control he had exercised over me had been unfortunately real. The woman he thought he had been supporting was wealthy enough to have walked away at any moment, yet had remained in the relationship hoping to build something authentic, despite the deception that circumstances had required. Sarah continued her presentation with the methodical precision of someone who had anticipated every possible objection and prepared comprehensive responses. The documentation she provided established not only my financial independence, but also the protected status of assets that had been carefully structured to remain separate from any marital property claims. The case law supporting these protections was extensive and favorable, reflecting decades of successful defense against exactly the kind of challenges that Wade was beginning to contemplate. However, the revelation of my trust fund represented only the first phase of the comprehensive strategy we had developed for these proceedings. The months of investigation into Richard's own financial activities had uncovered irregularities that would soon shift the focus from my assets to questions about his income sources and business practices. The man who had attempted to portray himself as the responsible breadwinner was about to face scrutiny that could have consequences extending far beyond our divorce settlement. The private investigator we had employed to document Richard's infidelity had discovered patterns of behavior that suggested systematic deception, extending beyond his personal relationships into his professional activities. The marketing firm where he served as senior vice president was involved in campaigns for clients whose business practices raised significant legal and ethical questions. Richard's personal involvement in these questionable activities had created potential liability that could affect both his career prospects and his financial stability. More troubling were the financial irregularities that our forensic accountant had identified in Richard's tax returns and business expense reports. The lifestyle he had maintained during our marriage appeared to exceed his documented income by substantial margins, suggesting either undisclosed income sources or systematic tax evasion that could result in criminal charges if discovered by federal authorities. These findings had been carefully documented and cross-referenced with public records, creating a comprehensive picture of Richard's financial situation that revealed significant vulnerabilities in his own position. The man who had entered these proceedings confident in his superior financial standing was about to discover that his own conduct was far more questionable than anything he might allege about my financial disclosures. Wade's increasingly desperate questions about potential claims against my trust assets revealed his growing understanding that his client's position had shifted from advantageous to potentially catastrophic. The routine divorce case that he had expected to resolve through standard intimidation tactics was evolving into complex litigation involving substantial assets and sophisticated legal protections that exceeded his typical experience. The psychological impact of revealing my true financial position was profound and liberating after years of maintaining the careful deception that had protected both my inheritance and my ability to experience authentic relationships. The burden of constantly monitoring my words and actions to avoid revealing information about my background had been enormous, requiring vigilance that had become psychologically exhausting over time. The relief of finally operating without constraint was accompanied by a sense of empowerment that reflected my grandmother's business philosophy about the importance of controlling one's own destiny rather than depending on others for financial security or emotional validation. The independence that my inheritance provided was not just economic but psychological, offering freedom from the manipulation and control that characterized Richard's approach to relationships. The strategic thinking that I had developed through managing my inheritance while maintaining my cover identity had provided excellent preparation for the complex legal and financial challenges involved in extricating myself from a marriage that had become psychologically damaging. The skills required to protect substantial assets from discovery were proving equally valuable in protecting myself from continued exploitation by someone who had never understood or appreciated my actual capabilities. The education I had received about Richard's character during our 8 years together was proving invaluable as I observed his reactions to the revelation of my financial independence. His immediate calculation about potential claims against assets he had never contributed to confirmed my grandmother's warnings about how money affected people's behavior and revealed the mercenary aspects of his personality that his initial charm had concealed. The months of preparation for this moment had required extraordinary discipline and coordination with legal and financial professionals, who understood the complexity of high-net-worth divorces, involving protected assets and potentially fraudulent conduct by opposing parties. The team we had assembled represented decades of combined experience with exactly the kind of challenges that Richard's misconduct had created. Sarah's systematic presentation of my financial documentation was serving multiple purposes simultaneously: establishing my independence from any claims Richard might make, demonstrating the futility of attempting to challenge sophisticated asset protection structures, and creating the foundation for examining his own financial irregularities that our investigation had uncovered. The power dynamic that had defined our marriage through Richard's belief in my financial dependence was being completely reversed as the true extent of my resources became apparent. The woman he had treated as property was revealing herself to possess not only substantial wealth, but also the intelligence and strategic thinking necessary to use those resources effectively in protecting her interests. Wade's professional facade was cracking under the pressure of representing a client whose position had deteriorated so dramatically in such a short period. The confident attorney who had entered the room expecting to negotiate a minimal settlement with a desperate woman was now facing someone with resources to hire the most sophisticated legal representation available, and the financial independence to reject any arrangement that did not serve her interests. The revelation that was transforming our divorce proceedings represented not just the end of my marriage but the beginning of my emergence, as someone free to operate authentically without the burden of concealing my true identity and capabilities. The strategic mind that had been hidden beneath the facade of artistic struggle was finally free to demonstrate its full capabilities in service of justice and accountability. Richard's continued silence reflected his growing understanding that the woman he thought he had married was disappearing before his eyes, replaced by someone with resources and determination that he had never suspected. The game he believed he was winning through superior financial position and legal representation was about to change rules entirely, with consequences that would extend far beyond our divorce settlement into questions about his own conduct that could affect his freedom as well as his finances. The afternoon sun streaming through the conference room windows illuminated more than just the legal documents spread across the polished table. It was revealing the emergence of my authentic self after years of strategic concealment, the transformation of apparent vulnerability into demonstrated strength, and the beginning of a process that would ensure justice for both personal betrayal and professional misconduct that had been hidden in shadows for too long. The afternoon light filtering through the conference room windows seemed to illuminate more than just legal documents, as I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this pivotal moment. The revelation of my trust fund had stunned Richard and Harrison Wade, but the true foundation of my strength lay not in the $67 million itself, but in the wisdom of the woman who had entrusted it to me and the relationships that had shaped my understanding of authentic power. My grandmother Elena Montrose had been far more than a successful businesswoman who built a textile empire from nothing. She had been my mentor, my moral compass, and the architect of the protective strategies that were now shielding me from Richard's desperate attempts to claim assets he had never contributed to or even known existed. Her influence extended far beyond financial inheritance to encompass principles about integrity, strategic thinking, and the importance of recognizing one's true worth, regardless of how others might perceive or attempt to diminish it. The memories of our conversations during my childhood and young adulthood had sustained me through the darkest periods of my marriage, when Richard's controlling behavior had made me question my own judgment and capabilities. Grandmother Elena had understood the challenges that substantial wealth created for maintaining authentic relationships, having witnessed family members whose lives had been damaged by fortune hunters and manipulative partners who saw dollar signs rather than human beings. Her stories about the importance of testing people's character before revealing the full extent of family resources had shaped my decision to conceal my inheritance from Richard throughout our courtship and marriage. She had taught me that genuine love must be based on appreciation for someone's character, intelligence, and values rather than their financial assets or social position. The elaborate deception I had maintained for 8 years represented not paranoia but wisdom gained through generations of experience with the corrupting influence of money on relationships. The phone conversation that had crystallized my resolve to take decisive action had not come from my grandmother, who had passed away 5 years earlier, but from her closest friend and business partner, Victoria Sterling. At 82, Victoria remained one of the most formidable businesswomen in the textile industry, and her perspective on my situation had provided the clarity that months of internal struggle had failed to produce. Victoria had called me on a Thursday evening 3 weeks before this confrontation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated corporate boardrooms and personal relationships with equal skill for over 6 decades. She had heard through mutual family friends about the challenges in my marriage, and wanted to offer guidance that drew on her extensive experience with similar situations. "Elena, darling," Victoria had begun, her tone combining warmth with unmistakable steel. "I have been hearing troubling things about that husband of yours, and I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what your grandmother would expect from you in these circumstances." Victoria's words had carried special significance because she had been present during many of my conversations with grandmother Elena about relationship challenges and the importance of protecting family assets from exploitation. She understood the protective strategies that had been established, and the principles that should guide my decisions when those protections were tested by real-world circumstances. "Your grandmother spent decades teaching you about strength, strategy, and the importance of recognizing your own worth," Victoria had continued. "She would be disappointed to see you allowing someone to treat you poorly simply because you have been generous enough to conceal your true capabilities from him. There comes a moment when protection becomes enabling, and when silence becomes complicity in your own mistreatment." The parallel Victoria drew between my situation and challenges she had faced during her own career had been both illuminating and inspiring. She described boardroom confrontations where male executives had dismissed her contributions and underestimated her strategic capabilities, only to discover that their assumptions had created opportunities for her to outmaneuver them decisively. "The most powerful weapon you possess is not your money, Elena," Victoria had explained, her voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. "It is the fact that he has no idea who you really are or what you are capable of accomplishing when you stop protecting him from the consequences of his behavior. The element of surprise, combined with thorough preparation, has toppled far more formidable opponents than your Richard." Victoria's analysis of my situation had revealed strategic opportunities that I had not fully appreciated during my months of careful planning. The comprehensive investigation I had conducted into Richard's financial activities represented not just evidence gathering but intelligence development that provided multiple avenues for ensuring justice while protecting my own interests. Her guidance had been particularly valuable regarding the psychological aspects of revealing hidden capabilities to someone who had systematically underestimated and dismissed them. Victoria understood from personal experience how shocking it could be for manipulative individuals to discover that their victims possessed resources and intelligence far beyond what they had imagined possible. "The transformation you will witness in Richard when he realizes he has been playing chess while you have been conducting a symphony will be remarkable," Victoria had predicted with evident satisfaction. "Men like him depend on maintaining the illusion of superiority over those they seek to control. When that illusion is shattered by undeniable evidence of their own limitations and your hidden strengths, the psychological impact often proves more devastating than any financial consequences." The conversation with Victoria had also provided crucial perspective on the broader significance of my situation beyond the immediate challenges of divorce proceedings. She had emphasized that my response to Richard's betrayal and attempted exploitation would set precedents that would influence how others perceived and treated me for the remainder of my life. "You are not just Elena Castellano fighting for a fair divorce settlement," Victoria had reminded me with characteristic directness. "You are Elena Montrose Castellano, inheritor of a legacy of women who refused to be diminished by those who underestimated them. Your grandmother built an empire by recognizing that true power comes from preparation, patience, and the strategic revelation of capabilities that others never suspected you possessed." This broader perspective had transformed my understanding of what was at stake in these proceedings. The legal battle with Richard was not simply about protecting my financial assets or achieving personal justice for his betrayal. It represented a test of whether I would honor the legacy of strength and strategic thinking that my grandmother had worked decades to establish and preserve for future generations. The influence of my late mother, Catherine Montrose Castellano, had also been crucial in shaping my approach to this confrontation. Although she had died when I was 16, her example of grace under pressure, and her commitment to principled behavior in difficult circumstances, had provided a moral framework that guided my decisions throughout the investigation and preparation process. My mother had faced her own challenges with fortune hunters and manipulative relationships during her youth, experiences that had taught her the importance of distinguishing between genuine affection and calculated investment in potentially profitable associations. Her stories about recognizing deception and maintaining dignity while confronting betrayal had prepared me for exactly the kind of psychological manipulation that characterized Richard's behavior. The letters my mother had written to me before her death, intended to be opened during significant life challenges, had provided wisdom that proved remarkably applicable to my current situation. Her advice about the importance of thorough preparation before confronting powerful opponents had guided my decision to spend months gathering evidence, rather than acting impulsively based on emotional responses to Richard's infidelity. "Strength without preparation is merely bluster," she had written in the letter I had opened after discovering Richard's affairs. "True power comes from combining moral clarity with strategic advantage, ensuring that when you choose to act, your position is unassailable, and your victory serves principles larger than personal vindication." The collective wisdom of these remarkable women had shaped not only my strategic approach to the divorce proceedings, but also my understanding of the broader purpose that my actions should serve. The revelation of my hidden capabilities was not simply about achieving personal justice, but about demonstrating that those who dismiss and underestimate others often create the conditions for their own downfall. Victoria's final words during our pivotal conversation had captured the essence of what this confrontation represented. "Your grandmother always said that the most dangerous opponents are those who allow themselves to be underestimated while carefully observing and preparing. Richard has spent 8 years providing you with comprehensive intelligence about his character, capabilities, and vulnerabilities, while remaining completely oblivious to your true nature. The strategic advantage you possess is unprecedented, and the justice you can achieve will honor every woman who has been dismissed by men who mistook silence for weakness." As Sarah Chen continued presenting evidence of Richard's financial misconduct to his increasingly desperate attorney, I drew strength from the knowledge that 3 generations of remarkable women had contributed to this moment. The trust fund that had stunned Richard represented not just financial inheritance but a legacy of strategic thinking, moral courage, and refusal to accept diminished expectations from those who lacked the wisdom to recognize authentic capability. The transformation occurring in the conference room reflected more than just the revelation of hidden assets. It represented the emergence of Elena Montrose Castellano, inheritor of wisdom, strength, and strategic capabilities that had been carefully developed over decades of preparation for exactly this type of challenge. Richard's shocked silence and Wade's desperate questioning revealed their growing understanding that they had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of their opponent. The woman they had dismissed as financially dependent and intellectually inferior was systematically demonstrating resources and capabilities that exceeded their own, while exposing vulnerabilities in their position that could have consequences extending far beyond divorce settlements into questions of criminal liability and professional survival. The voices of the women who had shaped my character and strategic approach were finally free to guide my actions without the constraint of maintaining protective deceptions. The patient, methodical revelation of my true capabilities was honoring their legacy, while ensuring that Richard's attempts to exploit perceived weakness would result in consequences that reflected the magnitude of his miscalculations about both my resources and my resolve. The weight of 8 years of careful deception was finally lifting from my shoulders as I made the conscious decision to fully embrace my authentic identity in this conference room confrontation. The strategic concealment that had protected both my inheritance and my ability to experience genuine relationships was no longer necessary or beneficial. The moment had arrived to demonstrate the full extent of my capabilities without the constraints that had defined my interactions with Richard throughout our marriage. Sarah Chen reached for a third folder, her movements reflecting the methodical precision that had characterized our months of preparation for this decisive encounter. The revelation of my trust fund had established my financial independence beyond dispute, but the comprehensive strategy we had developed extended far beyond simple asset protection into questions of accountability, justice, and the consequences that should follow systematic deception and betrayal. The psychological transformation I was experiencing felt profound and permanent as I shed the persona of Elena Castellano, struggling artist, and fully embraced my identity as Elena Montrose Castellano, strategic thinker and inheritor of a legacy that demanded excellence in both personal conduct and business relationships. The woman who had accepted diminished expectations and controlling behavior was disappearing forever, replaced by someone prepared to exercise the full measure of her capabilities and resources. Richard's continued silence reflected his growing comprehension that the foundation of his understanding about our relationship had been completely false. The financial dependence he had exploited to justify controlling behavior had never existed, while the intellectual superiority he had assumed was proving to be entirely imaginary. His attempts to manipulate someone he perceived as vulnerable were being exposed as efforts to control someone who possessed resources and strategic thinking that exceeded his own. Harrison Wade's increasingly desperate questions about potential claims against my trust assets revealed his recognition that his client's position had deteriorated beyond salvage through conventional legal maneuvering. The confident attorney who had entered these proceedings expecting to intimidate a defenseless woman was confronting someone with access to legal representation and financial resources that dwarfed his own experience with complex litigation. The decision to reveal my true identity and capabilities represented more than tactical advantage in divorce proceedings. It reflected a fundamental choice about how I intended to live the remainder of my life, and the principles that would guide my relationships and business decisions. The years of concealment had been necessary protection during a vulnerable period, but maintaining that deception indefinitely would have represented a betrayal of my own potential and the legacy of strength that my grandmother had worked decades to establish. My grandmother, Elena Montrose, had built her textile empire through strategic thinking, careful preparation, and the willingness to reveal her capabilities when circumstances demanded decisive action. Her success had not come from hiding her intelligence or downplaying her business acumen, but from understanding when to exercise those qualities most effectively. The lessons she had taught me about timing, preparation, and the psychological impact of revealing unexpected capabilities were proving invaluable in these proceedings. The months of investigation that had preceded this confrontation represented the most comprehensive application of analytical skills I had undertaken since inheriting my trust fund. The forensic accounting, legal research, and strategic planning required to build an unassailable case against Richard had demanded intellectual engagement that reminded me of my true capabilities and interests. The work had been challenging and rewarding in ways that my cover identity as a struggling artist had never provided. The private investigator we had employed to document Richard's professional misconduct was Marcus Rodriguez, a former federal agent whose expertise in financial crimes had made him invaluable in uncovering the sophisticated deception that characterized Richard's business practices. His investigation had revealed patterns of behavior that extended far beyond simple tax avoidance into systematic fraud that could result in criminal prosecution. Marcus had discovered that Richard's consulting arrangements with offshore clients involved companies that were under investigation by federal authorities for money laundering, securities fraud, and tax evasion. The payments he received for these services were structured to avoid detection by American regulatory agencies, indicating knowledge of their improper nature and deliberate intent to conceal income from taxation. The complexity of these arrangements suggested sophisticated understanding of financial concealment techniques that contradicted Richard's public persona as a legitimate marketing executive. The consulting fees, offshore transfers, and expense manipulations revealed someone who had been systematically deceiving not only his spouse, but also his employer and federal tax authorities for several years. Sarah began presenting this evidence with the systematic precision that had characterized her earlier revelations. The documentation she provided painted a comprehensive picture of financial misconduct that would make Richard's demands for spousal support appear not just inappropriate, but potentially grounds for criminal referral to federal prosecutors. Your client's consulting arrangements with offshore entities raise serious questions about compliance with federal reporting requirements and tax obligations, Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone presenting evidence that had been meticulously verified. Our analysis indicates systematic concealment of income that may constitute criminal tax evasion. The transformation in Wade's demeanor was immediate and dramatic, as he realized that his client had failed to disclose information that fundamentally altered the nature of their case. The routine divorce settlement that he had expected to negotiate was evolving into criminal defense consultation that exceeded his expertise and potentially his ethical obligations to the court. Richard's reaction revealed the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling under scrutiny that he had never anticipated. The confident man who had attempted to dictate settlement terms was confronting the possibility of federal investigation that could result in substantial penalties, asset forfeiture, and imprisonment. The irony of his position was overwhelming as I observed his growing panic while remembering the condescending manner in which he had treated my intelligence and judgment throughout our marriage. The woman he had dismissed as intellectually inferior was systematically exposing financial sophistication and criminal conduct that he had believed was concealed from detection. The strategic thinking that had guided my investigation into Richard's activities reflected skills and capabilities that I had inherited from my grandmother's business philosophy. Her approach to complex challenges had emphasized thorough preparation, comprehensive intelligence gathering, and the patient development of unassailable positions before engaging in decisive confrontation. The months of evidence gathering had required extraordinary discipline as I balanced the need to document Richard's misconduct against the risk of alerting him to the scrutiny his activities were receiving. The invisible woman who had moved through our marriage without recognition was proving to possess analytical capabilities that exceeded anything he had demonstrated in his professional career. Marcus Rodriguez's investigation had been particularly effective because Richard's narcissistic tendencies made him careless about concealing evidence from someone he viewed as intellectually inferior. His assumption that I lacked the sophistication to understand or investigate his business activities had created opportunities for comprehensive documentation that would have been impossible if he had respected my capabilities. The offshore consulting arrangements that provided Richard with substantial unreported income were documented through bank records, email communications, and travel expenses that created an undeniable pattern of deliberate tax evasion. The complexity of these schemes indicated criminal intent rather than innocent accounting errors or oversight. Sarah continued her presentation with methodical precision, building a comprehensive narrative of systematic deception that would shift the focus of our proceedings from my assets to Richard's potential criminal liability. Each piece of evidence contributed to a picture of someone who had been betraying not only his marriage, but also his legal obligations to federal authorities. The revelation of Richard's financial misconduct represented the culmination of a strategy that had transformed me from apparent victim to someone with the evidence and resources necessary to ensure that his attempts to exploit perceived weakness would result in consequences extending far beyond our divorce settlement into questions about his freedom and financial survival. Wade's increasingly frantic objections revealed his realization that his client had not only misrepresented the circumstances of our divorce, but had potentially involved him in legal proceedings that could expose both of them to sanctions for failing to disclose material information about Richard's criminal activities and potential federal liability. The psychological impact of revealing my true capabilities while simultaneously exposing Richard's criminal conduct was profound and empowering after years of accepting diminished expectations and controlling behavior. The woman who had been treated as property was demonstrating resources and intelligence that exceeded those of her supposed superior. The strategic patience that had enabled me to maintain my cover identity while gathering evidence of Richard's betrayal was producing results that exceeded even my expectations for justice and accountability. The comprehensive case we had built would ensure that his misconduct received scrutiny from both divorce courts and federal prosecutors. The decision to stand in complete truth about my identity and capabilities represented not just tactical advantage in these proceedings, but a fundamental choice about how I intended to engage with the world for the remainder of my life. The years of concealment had served their protective purpose, But authentic living required embracing my true nature and the responsibilities that accompanied substantial resources and capabilities. The legacy of strategic thinking and moral courage that my grandmother had established was finally free to guide my actions without constraint. The woman who had been dismissed and underestimated was systematically demonstrating that those who mistake silence for weakness often create the conditions for their own comprehensive defeat. The conference room atmosphere had transformed into something resembling a courtroom, as Harrison Wade frantically attempted to regain control of proceedings that had spiraled far beyond his initial expectations. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely as he confronted evidence of his client's criminal misconduct that could expose both of them to serious legal consequences. The routine divorce settlement he had anticipated negotiating through intimidation tactics had evolved into complex criminal defense consultation that exceeded his expertise and potentially his ethical obligations. Richard's silence had become increasingly strained as the full implications of his exposed financial activities began to crystallize in his mind. The man who had entered these proceedings believing he held absolute advantage over a financially dependent spouse was now facing the possibility of federal investigation, substantial monetary penalties, and potential imprisonment. His attempts to exploit what he perceived as my vulnerability had backfired in ways that demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of fundamentally misunderstanding one's opponent. The moment had arrived for me to demonstrate that the strategic thinking and analytical capabilities I had concealed throughout our marriage were not merely defensive mechanisms but powerful tools that could be wielded decisively when circumstances demanded action. The years of accepting diminished expectations and controlling behavior had provided comprehensive education about Richard's character, vulnerabilities, and methods of operation that now enabled me to anticipate and counter his every move. Sarah Chen's systematic presentation of evidence had established the foundation for what would become the most challenging test of my resolve and capabilities. The revelation of my trust fund and the exposure of Richard's criminal activities had fundamentally altered the dynamics of our divorce proceedings, but the real confrontation was only beginning as Wade attempted to salvage something from his client's deteriorating position. The private investigator Marcus Rodriguez had uncovered additional layers of Richard's deception that extended beyond simple tax evasion into more sophisticated criminal enterprises, involving money laundering and securities fraud. The consulting arrangements that had initially appeared to be aggressive tax avoidance were proving to be components of a larger criminal conspiracy involving multiple clients and offshore financial institutions. Marcus had discovered that several of Richard's consulting clients were companies under federal investigation for operating Ponzi schemes that had defrauded investors of hundreds of millions of dollars. The marketing campaigns that Richard had developed for these entities were designed specifically to attract new victims, while concealing the fraudulent nature of their investment opportunities. His involvement in these schemes made him potentially liable as a co-conspirator, rather than simply an unknowing service provider. The evidence revealed that Richard had received substantial payments for developing marketing materials that deliberately misrepresented the financial condition and investment opportunities offered by companies that regulatory agencies were investigating for systematic fraud. His sophisticated understanding of persuasion techniques and consumer psychology had been weaponized to facilitate crimes that destroyed the financial security of thousands of innocent investors. Wade's increasingly desperate objections revealed his growing realization that his client had failed to disclose involvement in criminal enterprises that could result in prosecution under federal racketeering statutes. The complexity of Richard's misconduct suggested that plea negotiations with federal prosecutors would be necessary to avoid lengthy prison sentences and comprehensive asset forfeiture. The psychological impact of revealing this evidence while maintaining my composed demeanor was profound as I observed Richard's transformation from confident aggressor to desperate defendant. The woman he had consistently underestimated was systematically exposing criminal conduct that he had believed was concealed from detection, while demonstrating analytical capabilities that exceeded anything he had achieved in his professional career. Sarah continued her presentation with methodical precision, building toward revelations that would make Richard's financial misconduct seem like minor infractions compared to the broader criminal conspiracy that our investigation had uncovered. The evidence she was preparing to present would demonstrate that his attempts to manipulate our divorce settlement represented just one component of a pattern of systematic deception that had characterized every aspect of his personal and professional life. The forensic accountant Margaret Thornton had analyzed financial records that revealed the true scope of Richard's criminal activities extended far beyond individual tax evasion into organized fraud that had been operating for several years. The offshore accounts that received his consulting fees were part of a complex money laundering operation, designed to conceal the proceeds of multiple criminal enterprises from detection by American regulatory authorities. Margaret's analysis had uncovered evidence that Richard's role in these criminal conspiracies was far more significant than his public persona as a marketing executive suggested. The consulting arrangements that had initially appeared to be simple tax avoidance schemes were actually integral components of sophisticated fraud operations that relied on his expertise in persuasion and consumer manipulation to attract and deceive victims. The transformation I was experiencing as I observed Richard's growing desperation felt both empowering and sobering, as I understood the full magnitude of the criminal conduct I had been unknowingly associated with through our marriage. The careful legal structures that protected my inheritance had also shielded me from potential liability for his activities, but the revelation of his crimes added urgent necessity to completing our divorce before federal investigations potentially expanded to include family members. Wade's frantic questions about the source and reliability of our evidence revealed his recognition that his client's position had deteriorated beyond salvage through conventional legal defense strategies. The routine divorce case that he had expected to resolve quickly was evolving into criminal defense consultation that would require expertise in federal racketeering prosecution and complex financial crimes. The strategic patience that I had developed through years of concealing my true identity and capabilities was finally producing results that exceeded my expectations for both justice and personal vindication. The comprehensive investigation that Marcus Rodriguez and Margaret Thornton had conducted had built an unassailable case that would ensure Richard's criminal conduct received the scrutiny it deserved from both divorce courts and federal prosecutors. Richard's continued silence reflected his growing comprehension that the woman he had spent 8 years dismissing and controlling possessed resources and intelligence that had enabled her to expose criminal activities he had believed were undetectable. His assumptions about intellectual superiority and strategic advantage had been completely false, while his attempts to exploit perceived vulnerability had created opportunities for his own comprehensive destruction. The decision to reveal the full extent of my capabilities and evidence was producing psychological effects that extended beyond simple strategic advantage in divorce proceedings. The years of accepting diminished expectations and controlling behavior were being avenged through demonstration of analytical skills and resource access that dwarfed anything Richard had achieved through his criminal enterprises. Sarah reached for yet another folder, her movements conveying the methodical precision that had characterized our months of preparation for this decisive confrontation. The evidence she was preparing to present would demonstrate that Richard's attempts to claim spousal support from someone he perceived as financially desperate represented not just civil fraud, but potentially criminal extortion, given his knowledge of his own criminal liability and desperate need for resources to fund legal defense. The revelation that was about to unfold would complete the transformation of our divorce proceedings from routine settlement negotiation into criminal prosecution referral that could result in Richard facing decades of federal imprisonment. The strategic thinking and comprehensive preparation that my grandmother's legacy had taught me were about to produce justice that exceeded anything I had imagined possible when I first discovered his infidelity 18 months earlier. Wade's professional facade was cracking under pressure, as he realized that his client had not only misrepresented the facts underlying their divorce case, but had potentially involved him in legal proceedings that could expose both of them to criminal liability for failing to disclose material information about ongoing federal investigations and Richard's role in sophisticated criminal conspiracies. The moment I had been building toward through months of careful investigation and strategic planning was finally arriving, as the full scope of Richard's criminal conduct was about to be revealed to someone whose legal expertise was entirely inadequate for the complex federal prosecution that would inevitably follow. The woman he had dismissed as intellectually inferior was about to demonstrate that strategic thinking combined with substantial resources could produce consequences that would define the remainder of his life. The psychological transformation I was experiencing felt permanent and empowering as I shed the last vestiges of the protective persona that had concealed my true capabilities throughout our marriage. The Elena Castellano who had accepted controlling behavior and diminished expectations was disappearing forever, replaced by Elena Montrose Castellano, strategic thinker and inheritor of a legacy that demanded excellence in confronting those who mistake kindness for weakness. The test of my resolve and capabilities was producing results that confirmed my grandmother's teachings about the importance of comprehensive preparation, strategic patience, and the decisive revelation of hidden strengths when circumstances demanded justice and accountability for systematic deception and betrayal. The conference room had transformed into a battlefield where conventional divorce law met federal criminal investigation, and Harrison Wade was rapidly discovering that his decades of experience with matrimonial disputes had not prepared him for the complexity of representing a client whose misconduct extended into sophisticated criminal enterprises. His attempts to regain control of the proceedings through procedural objections were failing, as each new revelation demonstrated that Richard's criminal activities had created legal exposure far beyond anything that standard divorce settlements could address. The escalation of our confrontation had reached a critical threshold where Richard's psychological composure finally began to crack under the weight of comprehensive evidence that threatened not only his financial security, but his personal freedom. The confident man who had attempted to dictate settlement terms was now facing the possibility of federal prosecution that could result in decades of imprisonment and complete asset forfeiture. Sarah Chen reached for the fourth and most devastating folder in her collection, her movements reflecting the methodical precision that had characterized our months of preparation for this decisive encounter. The evidence she was preparing to reveal would demonstrate that Richard's criminal activities had extended into areas that posed direct threats to national security, and had attracted the attention of federal agencies whose investigations could result in charges under terrorism financing and international money laundering statutes. The private investigator Marcus Rodriguez had uncovered connections between Richard's offshore consulting clients and criminal organizations that were under surveillance by federal agencies for activities that extended far beyond simple financial fraud into matters involving homeland security and international criminal conspiracies. The marketing expertise that Richard had provided to these entities had facilitated operations that posed genuine threats to American financial institutions and economic security. Marcus had discovered that several companies paying Richard substantial consulting fees were fronts for criminal organizations involved in cryptocurrency manipulation, ransomware attacks against critical infrastructure, and sophisticated identity theft operations that had compromised the personal information of millions of American citizens. The consulting arrangements that had initially appeared to be aggressive tax avoidance were actually components of criminal conspiracies that had been operating under federal surveillance for months. The revelation that Richard's involvement in these criminal enterprises had potentially exposed him to prosecution under federal terrorism statutes sent visible shockwaves through Wade's professional demeanor. The lawyer who had anticipated negotiating a routine divorce settlement was confronting evidence that his client had been operating under federal surveillance as part of investigations into threats against American economic security and critical infrastructure. Richard's reaction to this escalating revelation was immediate and dramatic as the color drained from his face and his hands began trembling with the recognition that his criminal activities had attracted attention from federal agencies, whose resources and determination far exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The man who had spent 8 years treating me as intellectually inferior was suddenly confronting evidence of analytical capabilities that had enabled comprehensive penetration of criminal activities he had believed were undetectable. The psychological impact of observing Richard's complete psychological collapse was both satisfying and sobering, as I understood that the investigation I had commissioned had uncovered criminal conduct that posed genuine threats to innocent people far beyond our personal relationship. The decision to expose his activities had evolved from personal vindication into public service that could protect countless potential victims from sophisticated criminal enterprises. Sarah began presenting this evidence with the systematic precision that had characterized her earlier revelations. But the gravity of the material she was revealing had transformed the atmosphere in the conference room into something resembling a federal grand jury proceeding. The documentation she provided painted a comprehensive picture of criminal conspiracy that would require coordination between multiple federal agencies and international law enforcement organizations. The forensic accountant Margaret Thornton had traced financial transactions that revealed Richard's role in money laundering operations that had processed hundreds of millions of dollars through offshore accounts controlled by criminal organizations under investigation by federal authorities. The complexity of these financial arrangements indicated sophisticated knowledge of international banking regulations and deliberate efforts to circumvent monitoring systems designed to detect terrorist financing and other threats to national security. Margaret's analysis had uncovered evidence that Richard's consulting arrangements involved developing marketing strategies for cryptocurrency exchanges that were being used to launder proceeds from ransomware attacks against hospitals, power grids, and other critical infrastructure. His expertise in consumer psychology and persuasion techniques had been weaponized to facilitate crimes that had resulted in deaths and billions of dollars in economic damage. The transformation occurring in the conference room reflected more than simple exposure of criminal conduct. The strategic thinking and comprehensive preparation that my grandmother's legacy had taught me were producing results that extended far beyond personal vindication into matters of genuine national importance that would require coordination with federal agencies whose resources dwarfed anything involved in typical divorce proceedings. Wade's increasingly frantic objections revealed his recognition that his client's criminal activities had created legal exposure that exceeded his expertise and potentially his ethical capacity to represent. The routine divorce case that he had expected to resolve through intimidation tactics had evolved into criminal defense consultation requiring expertise in federal terrorism statutes, international money laundering prosecutions, and complex national security investigations. The revelation of Richard's involvement in these sophisticated criminal enterprises had profound implications for my own legal position and safety considerations that extended far beyond typical divorce proceedings. The careful legal structures that protected my inheritance had also shielded me from potential liability for his criminal activities, but the revelation of his involvement in operations that posed threats to national security added urgency to ensuring my complete legal separation from his criminal enterprises. Richard's continued silence reflected his growing comprehension that the woman he had spent 8 years dismissing and controlling possessed resources and intelligence that had enabled her to expose criminal activities that federal agencies with sophisticated surveillance capabilities were still investigating. His assumptions about intellectual superiority and strategic advantage had been completely false, while his attempts to exploit perceived vulnerability had created opportunities for his own comprehensive destruction. The decision to reveal the full extent of Richard's criminal conduct represented more than strategic advantage in divorce proceedings. The evidence that Marcus Rodriguez and Margaret Thornton had compiled would be essential for federal prosecutors building cases against criminal organizations that pose genuine threats to American economic security and critical infrastructure operations. Sarah continued her presentation with methodical precision, building toward revelations that would complete the transformation of our divorce proceedings from civil litigation into criminal prosecution referral that would require coordination with federal agencies whose investigations extended into matters of homeland security and international criminal conspiracies. The psychological impact of revealing evidence that exposed criminal conduct threatening national security while maintaining my composed demeanor was profound as I observed Richard's transformation from confident aggressor to someone whose criminal activities had attracted attention from federal agencies with resources and determination that exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The strategic patience that I had developed through years of concealing my true identity and capabilities was producing results that extended far beyond personal vindication into contributions to national security investigations that could protect innocent people from sophisticated criminal enterprises that Richard had facilitated through his marketing expertise and financial arrangements. Wade's professional facade was completely cracking under pressure as he realized that his client had not only misrepresented the facts underlying their divorce case, but had potentially involved him in legal proceedings that could expose both of them to federal prosecution for failing to disclose material information about ongoing national security investigations and Richard's role in criminal conspiracies that posed threats to American economic stability. The moment I had been building toward through months of careful investigation and strategic planning was finally producing results that demonstrated how comprehensive preparation combined with substantial resources could uncover criminal conduct that threatened not only personal relationships but national security interests that required federal intervention and international cooperation to address effectively. The test of my resolve and capabilities was producing outcomes that confirmed my grandmother's teachings about the importance of thorough preparation, strategic patience, and the decisive revelation of hidden strengths when circumstances demanded justice and accountability for criminal conduct that extended far beyond personal betrayal into matters of genuine public importance and national security concern. The transformation occurring in Richard's demeanor reflected his growing recognition that his criminal activities had attracted scrutiny from federal agencies whose investigations could result in charges under terrorism statutes and national security laws that carried sentences far exceeding anything associated with typical financial crimes or divorce proceedings. The evidence that our investigation had compiled would ensure that Richard's criminal conduct received attention from federal prosecutors whose resources and expertise were specifically designed to address threats against American economic security and critical infrastructure that his consulting activities had helped facilitate through sophisticated criminal enterprises operating under federal surveillance. The revelation of Richard's involvement in criminal enterprises threatening national security had fundamentally altered the nature of our confrontation, transforming what had begun as divorce proceedings into a matter requiring immediate coordination with federal law enforcement agencies. The evidence that Marcus Rodriguez and Margaret Thornton had compiled was no longer simply relevant to our personal dispute, but constituted essential intelligence for ongoing investigations into sophisticated criminal organizations operating under federal surveillance. Sarah Chen reached for her secure communication device, an encrypted smartphone that enabled direct contact with federal prosecutors who specialized in national security cases. The gravity of the evidence we had uncovered required immediate notification of authorities whose expertise and resources were specifically designed to address threats against American economic infrastructure and homeland security interests. The psychological transformation occurring in Richard was profound, as he finally comprehended that his criminal activities had attracted attention from federal agencies whose investigative capabilities and legal authority far exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The confident marketing executive who had attempted to intimidate a financially dependent spouse was now facing the possibility of prosecution under terrorism statutes that carried potential life sentences and complete asset forfeiture. Harrison Wade had abandoned his earlier attempts to maintain professional composure as the scope of his client's criminal conduct became undeniable. The lawyer who had entered these proceedings expecting to negotiate a routine divorce settlement was now confronting evidence that would require criminal defense expertise in federal terrorism prosecutions, international money laundering cases, and complex national security investigations that exceeded his professional capabilities. The power of truth was demonstrating itself with devastating clarity, as each piece of evidence systematically dismantled the facade that Richard had maintained throughout our marriage and his professional career. The marketing consultant who had presented himself as a legitimate business executive was being revealed as someone whose expertise had been systematically employed to facilitate criminal enterprises that posed genuine threats to innocent people and critical infrastructure operations. Margaret Thornton's forensic analysis had traced financial transactions that revealed the true scope of Richard's involvement in criminal conspiracies, extending far beyond simple tax evasion or offshore consulting arrangements. The evidence showed that he had received substantial payments for developing sophisticated marketing campaigns designed to recruit victims for cryptocurrency fraud schemes that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal proceeds. These marketing campaigns had been specifically designed to target vulnerable populations, including elderly retirees, recent immigrants, and individuals facing financial hardships. Richard's expertise in consumer psychology had been weaponized to create persuasive materials that convinced these victims to invest life savings in fraudulent opportunities that were guaranteed to result in complete financial loss. The human cost of Richard's criminal activities was staggering, as Margaret's investigation revealed that the fraud schemes he had promoted through his marketing expertise had destroyed the financial security of thousands of families across multiple states. The retirement savings, college funds, and emergency reserves of countless innocent people had been stolen through sophisticated deception that relied on Richard's professional skills to appear legitimate and trustworthy. Marcus Rodriguez had uncovered additional evidence that Richard's criminal activities had extended into areas that posed direct threats to American military operations and diplomatic security. The cryptocurrency exchanges that he had helped promote through his marketing campaigns were being used to fund terrorist organizations and hostile foreign intelligence services that posed genuine threats to national security and American personnel overseas. The consulting fees that Richard had received from these criminal enterprises had been structured through shell companies registered in countries that were known to harbor terrorist financing operations and money laundering activities that supported hostile foreign governments. His involvement in these operations had potentially exposed him to prosecution under espionage statutes and foreign agent registration requirements that carried severe penalties, including potential death sentences. Sarah began coordinating with federal prosecutors whose expertise in national security cases would be essential for ensuring that Richard's criminal conduct received appropriate attention from law enforcement agencies, with jurisdiction over crimes that crossed international boundaries and threatened homeland security interests. The evidence we had compiled would be crucial for federal investigators building comprehensive cases against criminal organizations that had been operating under surveillance for months. The transformation occurring in the conference room reflected more than simple exposure of criminal misconduct. The strategic thinking and comprehensive preparation that had guided our investigation were producing results that would contribute to national security operations designed to protect American citizens and infrastructure from sophisticated criminal enterprises operating with foreign government support. Richard's continued silence had evolved from shock into something approaching complete psychological collapse as he absorbed the implications of having his criminal activities exposed through investigation techniques that had penetrated security measures he had believed were impenetrable. The woman he had consistently underestimated had demonstrated analytical capabilities and resource access that exceeded those of sophisticated criminal organizations with international operations. The evidence that our investigation had produced was creating momentum that extended far beyond our personal dispute into matters of genuine national importance that would require coordination between multiple federal agencies and international law enforcement organizations. The consulting arrangements that Richard had believed were concealed from detection had been operating under federal surveillance, and his activities had been documented as part of broader investigations into criminal conspiracies. Wade's professional obligations were becoming increasingly complex, as he realized that his client's criminal activities had created conflicts of interest that might require him to withdraw from representation to avoid potential prosecution for obstruction of justice or conspiracy charges. The routine divorce case that he had expected to resolve through standard negotiation techniques had evolved into criminal defense consultation that exceeded his ethical capacity to provide. The power of undeniable truth was producing psychological effects that extended beyond Richard's personal crisis into validation of principles that had guided my grandmother's business philosophy throughout her career. Her teachings about the importance of comprehensive preparation, strategic patience, and moral courage were proving their worth in circumstances that tested every aspect of my character and capabilities. The revelation of Richard's criminal conduct was also providing profound satisfaction as I observed the complete collapse of his attempts to exploit what he had perceived as my vulnerability. The financial dependence that he had used to justify controlling behavior throughout our marriage had been entirely fabricated, while the intellectual superiority he had assumed was proving to be completely imaginary. Sarah's coordination with federal prosecutors was proceeding with efficiency that reflected months of preparation for exactly this scenario. The legal frameworks that protected my inheritance had also established protocols for cooperating with federal investigations, while maintaining the confidentiality and security that substantial wealth required in complex criminal cases involving national security considerations. The strategic thinking that had enabled me to maintain my cover identity while gathering comprehensive evidence of Richard's criminal activities was producing results that would ensure his misconduct received scrutiny from federal agencies whose resources and determination were specifically designed to address threats against American economic security and homeland security interests. The psychological impact of revealing evidence that exposed criminal conduct threatening national security while maintaining complete composure was profound, as I understood that the investigation I had commissioned had accomplished something far more significant than personal vindication. The decision to expose Richard's activities would contribute to protecting innocent people from sophisticated criminal enterprises that had been operating with impunity. The transformation occurring in Richard's demeanor reflected his growing recognition that the woman he had spent 8 years dismissing and controlling possessed capabilities that had enabled comprehensive penetration of criminal activities that federal agencies with sophisticated surveillance systems were still investigating. His assumptions about strategic advantage and intellectual superiority had been completely false. The evidence that Marcus Rodriguez and Margaret Thornton had compiled would be essential for federal prosecutors building cases against criminal organizations that had been facilitating terrorist financing and money laundering operations with foreign government support. The consulting expertise that Richard had provided to these enterprises had made him an integral component of criminal conspiracies that posed genuine threats to national security. The power of truth was demonstrating its capacity to create momentum that extended far beyond personal relationships into matters of national importance that required federal intervention and international cooperation to address effectively. The comprehensive preparation and strategic patience that had guided our investigation were producing results that confirmed the value of authentic strength over artificial manipulation. The secure communication device in Sarah Chen's hand connected her directly with federal prosecutor Amanda Harrison, whose specialized unit within the Department of Justice handled cases involving national security threats and complex international criminal conspiracies. The evidence that our investigation had compiled was no longer merely relevant to divorce proceedings, but constituted critical intelligence for ongoing federal operations targeting sophisticated criminal networks that posed genuine threats to American economic infrastructure and homeland security. The transformation in the conference room atmosphere was immediate and palpable as the gravity of our situation shifted from civil litigation to criminal prosecution coordination. Harrison Wade had abandoned any pretense of maintaining professional composure as he absorbed the reality that his client's criminal activities had been operating under federal surveillance and would require expertise in terrorism statutes, international money laundering laws, and national security prosecutions that exceeded his professional capabilities. Richard's psychological collapse was accelerating as he confronted the comprehensive nature of his exposed criminal conduct and the federal agencies whose investigations had been documenting his activities for months. The marketing consultant who had maintained elaborate facades throughout our marriage was finally experiencing the consequences of systematic deception that extended far beyond personal relationships into criminal enterprises that had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies with unlimited resources and determination. The evidence that Marcus Rodriguez and Margaret Thornton had compiled was creating momentum within federal law enforcement circles that would ensure Richard's criminal activities received scrutiny from prosecutors whose expertise was specifically designed to address threats against American economic security and critical infrastructure operations. The consulting arrangements that he had believed were concealed from detection had been operating under comprehensive surveillance as part of broader investigations into criminal conspiracies. Federal prosecutor Amanda Harrison's initial assessment of our evidence confirmed that Richard's involvement in terrorist financing operations and ransomware attacks against critical infrastructure had created criminal liability under multiple federal statutes that carried potential life sentences and mandatory asset forfeiture provisions. The consulting fees he had received from criminal organizations were traceable through financial systems that had been monitored by federal agencies as part of ongoing national security investigations. The human cost of Richard's criminal activities was becoming clearer as federal investigators shared information about the victims whose financial security had been destroyed through fraudulent investment schemes that relied on his marketing expertise to appear legitimate and trustworthy. The elderly retirees, recent immigrants, and financially vulnerable individuals who had been targeted through his sophisticated persuasion campaigns represented thousands of families whose lives had been devastated by criminal enterprises he had helped facilitate. Sarah's coordination with federal prosecutors was proceeding according to protocols that had been established during our months of preparation for exactly this scenario. The legal frameworks that protected my inheritance had also created structures for cooperating with federal investigations while maintaining the confidentiality and security that substantial wealth required in complex criminal cases involving national security considerations and international criminal organizations. The strategic thinking that had guided our investigation was producing results that extended far beyond personal vindication into contributions to national security operations, designed to protect American citizens and infrastructure from sophisticated criminal enterprises operating with foreign government support. The evidence we had compiled would be essential for federal prosecutors building comprehensive cases against criminal organizations that had been facilitating terrorist financing and money laundering operations. Richard's continued silence reflected his growing comprehension that the woman he had spent 8 years dismissing and controlling possessed analytical capabilities and resource access that had enabled comprehensive penetration of criminal activities that federal agencies with sophisticated surveillance systems were still investigating. His assumptions about intellectual superiority and strategic advantage had been completely false, while his attempts to exploit perceived vulnerability had created opportunities for his own comprehensive destruction. The revelation of Richard's criminal conduct was providing profound psychological satisfaction, as I observed the complete collapse of his attempts to manipulate our divorce proceedings through intimidation tactics based on assumed financial superiority. The woman he had treated as intellectually inferior was systematically exposing criminal activities that demonstrated his own moral bankruptcy and strategic incompetence. Wade's professional obligations were becoming increasingly complex as he realized that his client's criminal activities had created ethical conflicts that might require him to withdraw from representation to avoid potential prosecution for obstruction of justice or conspiracy charges. The routine divorce case that he had expected to resolve through standard intimidation techniques had evolved into criminal defense consultation that exceeded his ethical capacity to provide while maintaining his own legal safety. The power of comprehensive preparation was demonstrating itself through results that confirmed my grandmother's business philosophy about the importance of thorough investigation, strategic patience, and moral courage when confronting systematic deception and criminal conduct. Her teachings about the value of authentic strength over artificial manipulation were proving their worth in circumstances that tested every aspect of character and capabilities. Federal Prosecutor Harrison's preliminary review of our evidence indicated that Richard's criminal activities had been operating as integral components of larger criminal conspiracies that had been under federal investigation for over 2 years. The consulting expertise he had provided to terrorist financing operations and ransomware networks had made him a significant target for prosecution under racketeering statutes that would require forfeiture of all assets connected to his criminal enterprises. The transformation occurring in Richard's demeanor reflected his growing recognition that his criminal activities had attracted scrutiny from federal agencies whose investigations extended into matters of homeland security and international criminal conspiracies that required coordination with foreign law enforcement organizations. The confident marketing executive who had attempted to dictate settlement terms was now facing prosecution under terrorism statutes that carried sentences far exceeding anything associated with typical financial crimes. Margaret Thornton's forensic analysis had traced financial transactions that revealed Richard's role in money laundering operations that had processed over $500 million through offshore accounts controlled by criminal organizations under investigation by federal authorities. The complexity of these financial arrangements indicated sophisticated knowledge of international banking regulations and deliberate efforts to circumvent monitoring systems designed to detect terrorist financing and other threats to national security. The consulting arrangements that had provided Richard with substantial unreported income were documented through bank records, communication intercepts, and surveillance reports that created an undeniable pattern of deliberate criminal activity extending over several years. The evidence showed systematic involvement in criminal conspiracies, rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment or accounting irregularities. Sarah's presentation of this evidence to federal prosecutors was proceeding with efficiency that reflected our comprehensive preparation for cooperation with law enforcement agencies, whose investigations required careful coordination to avoid compromising ongoing operations against criminal organizations that posed continuing threats to national security and economic stability. The psychological impact of revealing evidence that exposed criminal conduct threatening national security while maintaining complete composure was profound, as I understood that the investigation I had commissioned had accomplished something far more significant than personal justice. The decision to expose Richard's activities would contribute to protecting innocent people from sophisticated criminal enterprises that had been operating with apparent impunity. Federal prosecutors were confirming that Richard's involvement in cryptocurrency fraud schemes and ransomware operations had created criminal liability under multiple federal statutes, including terrorism financing laws, racketeering provisions, and international money laundering regulations that carried mandatory minimum sentences and comprehensive asset forfeiture requirements that would eliminate any possibility of him maintaining financial resources for legal defense. The evidence that our investigation had produced was creating legal momentum that would ensure Richard's criminal conduct received attention from federal agencies whose resources and expertise were specifically designed to address threats against American economic infrastructure and homeland security interests. The comprehensive preparation and strategic patience that had guided our investigation were producing results that extended far beyond personal vindication into matters of genuine national importance. The transformation in the conference room reflected more than simple exposure of criminal misconduct. The strategic thinking and moral courage that had enabled me to maintain my cover identity while gathering comprehensive evidence were producing outcomes that would contribute to national security operations and protect countless innocent people from criminal enterprises that Richard had facilitated through his professional expertise and criminal associations. The conference room had transformed into a coordinated command center as federal investigators began implementing protocols for managing cases that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and involved multiple law enforcement agencies with overlapping interests in Richard's criminal activities. Federal prosecutor Amanda Harrison had been joined by representatives from the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, and the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The evidence that Marcus Rodriguez and Margaret Thornton had compiled was being integrated into a comprehensive federal investigation that had been developing parallel intelligence about the criminal organizations that Richard had served through his consulting arrangements. The marketing expertise he had provided to terrorist financing operations and ransomware networks had made him a significant target for prosecution under statutes that would require coordination between domestic law enforcement agencies and international partners. Sarah Chen's methodical presentation of our evidence was facilitating cooperation between federal agencies whose investigations had been proceeding independently until our documentation revealed the connections between Richard's activities and broader criminal conspiracies under federal surveillance. The strategic thinking that had guided our preparation was producing outcomes that extended far beyond personal vindication into contributions that would strengthen ongoing national security operations. The psychological transformation occurring in Richard was profound as he absorbed the reality that multiple federal agencies had been investigating criminal organizations that had paid him substantial consulting fees for marketing services that facilitated fraud schemes targeting American citizens and critical infrastructure. The confident marketing executive who had attempted to intimidate a financially dependent spouse was now facing prosecution under terrorism statutes that carried potential life sentences and mandatory asset forfeiture provisions. Harrison Wade had requested immediate consultation with criminal defense attorneys who specialized in federal terrorism prosecutions and international money laundering cases, acknowledging that his expertise in matrimonial law was entirely inadequate for representing a client whose criminal activities had created exposure under multiple federal statutes that exceeded his professional capabilities. The routine divorce settlement he had expected to negotiate through intimidation tactics had evolved into criminal defense coordination that required expertise he did not possess. Federal investigators were confirming that Richard's consulting arrangements with cryptocurrency exchanges and investment fraud operations had been integral components of larger criminal enterprises that had been facilitating terrorist financing and money laundering for hostile foreign governments and international criminal organizations. The consulting fees he had received were traceable through financial systems that had been monitored as part of ongoing national security investigations extending across multiple continents. The alliance between federal agencies that was forming around our evidence represented validation of the comprehensive preparation and strategic patience that had guided our investigation from its inception. The analytical capabilities and resource access that I had inherited from my grandmother's business philosophy were producing results that would contribute to protecting American citizens and infrastructure from sophisticated criminal enterprises that pose genuine threats to economic stability and homeland security. Margaret Thornton's forensic analysis was being integrated with existing federal intelligence about money laundering operations that had processed over $1 billion through offshore accounts controlled by criminal organizations under investigation for facilitating terrorist attacks, ransomware operations against hospitals and power grids, and sophisticated fraud schemes that had destroyed the financial security of thousands of American families. The evidence revealed that Richard's role in these criminal conspiracies had been far more significant than his public persona as a legitimate marketing consultant suggested. His expertise in consumer psychology and persuasion techniques had been specifically sought by criminal organizations that required sophisticated marketing campaigns to recruit victims and conceal the fraudulent nature of their operations from regulatory detection. Federal Prosecutor Harrison was coordinating with international law enforcement partners, whose investigations had been tracking the same criminal organizations that had employed Richard's consulting services. The evidence we had compiled would be essential for prosecutors in multiple countries who were building comprehensive cases against transnational criminal networks that had been operating with apparent impunity across international boundaries. The transformation in the conference room atmosphere reflected more than simple coordination between law enforcement agencies. The strategic thinking and moral courage that had enabled me to maintain my cover identity while gathering comprehensive evidence were facilitating cooperation that would strengthen international efforts to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises that posed continuing threats to economic stability and public safety. Richard's continued silence had evolved from psychological shock into recognition that his criminal activities had attracted attention from federal agencies whose investigations extended into matters that required coordination with foreign intelligence services and international law enforcement organizations. The marketing consultant who had maintained elaborate facades throughout our marriage was finally confronting the comprehensive consequences of systematic deception that had created criminal liability under multiple federal statutes. The alliance between federal agencies that was developing around our evidence represented unprecedented cooperation between organizations whose jurisdictional boundaries had previously limited their ability to address transnational criminal conspiracies effectively. The comprehensive nature of our investigation had provided the connecting intelligence that enabled prosecutors to understand how Richard's consulting activities had facilitated criminal operations that crossed multiple jurisdictions and threatened various aspects of American security. Sarah's coordination with federal prosecutors was proceeding according to protocols that reflected months of preparation for cooperation with law enforcement agencies, whose investigations required careful management to avoid compromising ongoing operations against criminal organizations that continued to pose threats to national security and economic infrastructure. The legal frameworks that protected my inheritance had also established structures for participating in federal investigations while maintaining confidentiality requirements. The evidence that Marcus Rodriguez had compiled was being verified through federal surveillance systems that had been monitoring the same criminal organizations that had employed Richard's marketing expertise. The consulting arrangements that he had believed were concealed from detection had been operating under comprehensive federal surveillance, as part of broader investigations into terrorist financing and international money laundering operations. Federal investigators were confirming that Richard's involvement in cryptocurrency fraud schemes had created criminal liability under racketeering statutes that would require forfeiture of all assets connected to his criminal enterprises. The consulting fees he had received from terrorist financing operations were subject to seizure under federal forfeiture provisions that would eliminate his ability to fund legal defense against the multiple charges that federal prosecutors were preparing to file. The psychological impact of observing this alliance of federal agencies coordinating their investigations around evidence that our preparation had produced was profound, as I understood that the decision to expose Richard's criminal activities was contributing to national security operations that would protect countless innocent people from sophisticated criminal enterprises that had been operating with foreign government support. The transformation occurring in Richard's demeanor reflected his growing recognition that the woman he had spent 8 years dismissing and controlling had demonstrated analytical capabilities that enabled penetration of criminal activities that multiple federal agencies with sophisticated surveillance systems were still investigating. His assumptions about intellectual superiority and strategic advantage had been completely false, while his attempts to exploit perceived vulnerability had created opportunities for comprehensive exposure of criminal conduct. Federal Prosecutor Harrison's preliminary assessment indicated that Richard's criminal activities would be prosecuted under terrorism financing statutes, international money laundering laws, and racketeering provisions that carried mandatory minimum sentences exceeding 20 years, and comprehensive asset forfeiture requirements that would eliminate any possibility of maintaining resources for legal defense. The evidence we had compiled would be essential for building cases that would dismantle criminal organizations operating across multiple jurisdictions. The alliance of justice that was forming around our investigation represented validation of principles that had guided my grandmother's business philosophy throughout her career. Her teachings about the importance of comprehensive preparation, strategic patience, and moral courage were proving their worth in circumstances that required cooperation with federal agencies whose missions involved protecting American citizens and infrastructure from sophisticated threats that required international coordination to address effectively. The strategic thinking that had enabled me to maintain my cover identity while gathering evidence of Richard's criminal activities was producing results that would contribute to dismantling criminal organizations that posed genuine threats to economic stability and homeland security. The comprehensive preparation that had guided our investigation was facilitating cooperation between federal agencies whose combined resources would ensure that criminal conduct received appropriate attention from prosecutors with jurisdiction over crimes that threatened national security interests. The institutional machinery of American law enforcement had begun operating with remarkable efficiency as multiple federal agencies coordinated their responses to the comprehensive evidence that our investigation had provided. Within 48 hours of Sarah Chen's initial contact with federal prosecutor Amanda Harrison, a joint task force had been established to address the national security implications of Richard's criminal activities and their connections to broader international criminal conspiracies that had been operating under federal surveillance. The response from established institutions demonstrated how individual courage and strategic preparation could catalyze systematic change within complex bureaucratic structures that typically required extensive coordination and approval processes to achieve meaningful action. The evidence that Marcus Rodriguez and Margaret Thornton had compiled was providing the connecting intelligence that federal agencies needed to transform separate investigations into comprehensive prosecutorial strategies targeting transnational criminal networks. Federal Judge Patricia Melbourne had been assigned to oversee the legal proceedings that would emerge from our investigation, bringing decades of experience in national security cases and complex international criminal prosecutions to ensure that Richard's activities received appropriate judicial attention. Her preliminary review of the evidence indicated that the scope of criminal conduct would require coordination between federal courts in multiple jurisdictions and cooperation with international legal systems. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had initiated comprehensive asset freezing procedures that would prevent Richard from accessing financial resources connected to his criminal enterprises, while federal prosecutors prepared indictments under terrorism financing statutes and international money laundering laws. The consulting fees he had received from criminal organizations were being traced through sophisticated financial monitoring systems that would ensure complete asset recovery for victim compensation. Richard's psychological state had deteriorated significantly as he absorbed the reality that federal agencies with unlimited resources and international jurisdiction were responding to his criminal activities, with coordinated investigations that would eliminate any possibility of avoiding prosecution through legal maneuvering or plea negotiations. The marketing consultant who had maintained elaborate deceptions throughout our marriage was finally confronting institutional responses that matched the magnitude of his criminal conduct. Harrison Wade had formally withdrawn from representation after acknowledging that his client's criminal activities had created ethical conflicts that exceeded his professional capacity to address, while maintaining his own legal safety. The routine divorce case that he had expected to resolve through standard intimidation techniques had evolved into federal criminal prosecution that required expertise in terrorism statutes and international law that he did not possess. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.